Hello, so I think we are ready to start again now. I'd like to welcome you back if you were with us this morning, or welcome you if you're joining us for the first time today. This is our second session of the day. We will be talking about policy challenges. I'm Vivian Booth. I'm the seabird specialist in the RSPB ecology team, and I was lucky enough to study terns for 3 summers on Coquet Island. Our first speaker actually did the same thing. He was the first in a long line of PhD students studying terns on Coquet Island. He is Ewan Dunn, and I think in the days when he was studying on Coquet, the student accommodation was a shed, which was just outside the gardens of the lighthouse. In my day, it had been demoted to a tool store and shed, occasionally used as a hide as well. And I believe it's now blown down. So that tells you something about the glamour of seabird fieldwork. Having escaped from Cocatraz, Ewan then worked for the RSPB for over 25 years and has only just recently retired. In that time, he worked on a huge number of projects, of course, but among them, he was looking at the hunting pressure faced by roseate terns in Ghana on the wintering grounds. And that project culminated in the Save the Sea Short Birds project in 1985. He also conducted the first ever comprehensive census of the roseate tern breeding population on the Azores. Ewan's going to be speaking live, but we'll be taking questions after the presentation. So if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A box. Okay, thank you, Ewan.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about fish and climate change and fisheries. Thank you very much for the introduction, Viv, and good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, so this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover forage fish prey for roseates in Britain and Ireland, the impacts of climate change and fisheries, and fisheries policy and management. There is a caveat that most of the interactions I'm going to be talking about have been mediated through other seabirds, but of course I'll be reflecting on the relevance for roseates as I go along. So just to turn to the prey species, and of course we're familiar with most of these, if not all of them. Lesser sand eel, as far as the North Sea is concerned, it's the most abundant fish species in the North Sea by a long chalk. When it matures as an adult, it's sedentary on discrete offshore sandbanks. So that makes it potentially vulnerable to overexploitation by commercial fishing. It hibernates in the winter months, and it emerges from the sand in late December, January to spawn. And when the larvae metamorphose into juveniles, the so-called O group, these develop to the size . The other two prey species are juvenile. I'm so sorry about this. My internet connection is unstable, it's saying, and this is why I'm having some difficulties. If you will excuse me. This is not good. I'm trying to get back to herring and sprat. Apologies.
Hi, Ewan. Would it be at all helpful if Becca has control of your presentation, and when you want the slide to change, you just say next slide and she'll click through it for you? Okay, we might have lost Ewan temporarily, but we'll give him a minute or so. Okay, looks like Ewan is moving location. I'm sure to try and improve his internet connection. So we'll see if this helps. Yeah. Hi, Ewan, you're back with us. I don't know if you heard what I just said, but I don't know if it would be helpful maybe if Becca clicks through the presentation for you, and then you could just say next slide when you want it to change.
Well, I'll see how I get on, and if that's necessary, I shall ask on the chat line. Is that okay?
Yep, that's no problem. Thank you.
So I was talking about the forage fish prey, and the other two prey apart from sand eel are juvenile herring and sprat. And I've just, for interest, put vertical red lines on these two because it's one of the diagnostic features is that in the sprat, the front of the pelvic and the dorsal fin are vertically aligned, whereas in the herring above there, you see that the pelvic fin starts slightly behind the front of the dorsal fin. And this is a useful thing to know for field workers who get clupeids in the hand. So what's the impact of climate change on these forage fish species? Well, Paul spoke yesterday about the increasing incidence of severe storm events, and I'm not going to touch on that, but it's relevant, of course. But I want to talk about a much more insidious thing, which is the increase in sea surface temperature. And I'm going to take the North Sea as an example. And you can see from this graph that for about 100 years, the temperature was relatively stable, fluctuating a little. And then in the early 80s, it really took off and has increased by about a degree in 30 years. And this is a massive change for a stable marine ecosystem to deal with. And it's had a massive impact on the plankton community, which of course is the basis of the food chain for the forage fish. So this is information from the Sir Alistair Hardy Foundation work, roughly a 70% decline in the Calanus copepods in the North Sea since the 1960s. And if you follow these four heat maps from top left to bottom right, follow the red arrows, the high biomass of zooplankton is shown by the yellow and the orange, and you can see that as you go through the time series, it virtually disappears as the cold water Calanus shrinks into the northern boreal waters. If I show this graphically, you can see that the overall decline since the 1960s in the abundance of the Calanus, but the blue columns are the cold water Calanus finmarchicus, the one that's disappearing, and it's being replaced, but at a much lower abundance, by the warmer water Calanus helgolandicus, which is shown by the yellow and the orange columns. So just to flesh this out a little bit, compared with the cold water finmarchicus, the warmer water helgolandicus is less abundant and the individuals are smaller and less nutritious. There are different seasonal peaks and troughs between these two species. The peak abundance and egg production of finmarchicus, which coincides with the early larval stages of the sand eel, and you can imagine some adaptation of the sand eel to that timing, whereas helgolandicus peaks later in the year. So what are the impact of these changes on sand eel? Well, the interactions have been well studied, and there's quite a lot of evidence behind these two bullets here. The first is that the timing mismatch of hatching sand eel eggs and helgolandicus abundance, that's the new kid on the block, reduces the survival and growth of sand eel larvae. And the second is that the higher sea temperatures that I spoke about are accelerating the metabolic rate of the juvenile sand eels, reducing their growth and their energy reserves. That means that they go into hibernation with fewer resources, and this leads to higher winter mortality. But it's not only the abundance and the availability of sand eels that's a problem. But just before I get to that, sorry, this is the just the general impact of those changes on the sand eels abundance since the early 1990s. And you can see in the late 80s up to 1 million tons spawning stock biomass, reducing to around about 200,000 tons at the present time, a massive reduction. Don't worry about the lines at the bottom. Those are fish reference points that we don't need to get into here. So the sand eel stock has taken a huge hit. But as I say, it's not just the abundance, it's also the quality of the individual sand eels. And this is a very elegant work by Sarah Wanless and colleagues on the Isle of May. I'm grateful to them for this slide. There's been a long-term reduction in sand eel length and energy content on the Isle of May as interpreted from fish loads brought in by puffins. And you can see on the left there in the graph, the adults are the yellow dots, the juvenile sand eels are the red dots, and a pretty impressive decline over the years, amounting to about 40%. So when seabirds go out to sea, they're not only finding fewer sand eels, but the individuals they do find are less nutritious. And this has impacted on seabirds, as discovered by researchers again on the Isle of May, Morten Fredrickson and co. His work on the Isle of May kittiwakes, which are very sensitive to changes in forage fish, and the productivity and the adult survival, importantly so, were lower after winters with higher sea temperatures because of the ecosystem disruption that I've just described. And interestingly, lower still when a sand eel fishery was operating in the vicinity. And that led in the year 2000 to the creation of a closed area to sand eel fishing, shown by the red box there, to the big commercial Danish industrial fishery for sand eels. And the lower edge of that box intersects the Farne Islands and Coquet, interestingly. So a large closed area was set up. But actually nowadays, the sand eel fishery is mostly in further south. And in this map, I show the yellow patches are the sandbanks and the distribution of the fishing effort by the Danish fleet. And the red oval is the Dogger Bank, effectively, much of it in the UK part of the Dogger Bank, and which is relatively close to the Yorkshire coast. And I've shown there the Flamborough and Filey SPA. Now, the Danish fleet is catching fewer and fewer sand eels on the Dogger Bank. That graph more or less mirrors the decline in spawning stock biomass I showed you a couple of minutes ago. And this fishing effort on the Dogger Bank is impacting, we believe, the productivity of the kittiwakes on the Yorkshire coast. And there I've popped up a paper published in the last few years by Matthew Carroll and colleagues, which describes this interaction between the fishery and the success of the birds on the coast. So it's a considerable worry. It's not just kittiwake, but other sand eel dependent seabirds we know are also being impacted in this way. And taken together, this has led the RSPB to make some pretty far-reaching proposals quite recently. And our proposal to governments is to close all UK waters to commercial fishing for sand eels. And if we fail in that sort of nuclear option, if you like, the fallback is to close the UK part of the Dogger Bank at least, and all of Scottish waters. There are political opportunities for doing this as the UK leaves, now that we've left the European Union and to become an independent coastal state, opportunities through the upcoming new fisheries bill and the emerging conservation strategies for seabirds in Scotland and England. And we've been promoting this to those administrations. But there's one other important policy goal, which is to amend the methodology, and this is being promoted to ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of Sea, that advises the European Union on fisheries management, to amend their methodology for setting annual catch limits. Now, at the moment, the methodology takes some account of the amount of fish, that's forage fish, that seabirds are estimated to consume, but takes no account of the biomass that needs to be left in the sea in order for those seabirds to find the relatively small proportion that they actually consume. And so we're asking for a greater set aside, so to speak, of the sand eel stock to be left for seabirds. And here I'd like to acknowledge the work of Richard Caldo in Natural England, who's developed this work and will be promoting it. So what's the relevance of all this to roseates? And I have to say the jury's out really, and perhaps it's not as big a problem for roseates as we might fear. Currently, there's no evidence of sand eel shortage around Coquet, as Paul made very clear yesterday. There's very little commercial sand eel fishing effort locally. As I said, it's much further south. On the Firth of Forth Islands, which were formerly occupied by roseates in small numbers, those are already protected by the existing sand eel closed area. Historically and currently, there's no industrial fishing for sand eels in the Irish Sea. But all of this has to be taken into account in the context of the increasing cumulative threats offshore, not just from fishing, but from the climate change I've described, and also from the increasing development of offshore wind. What about the other fish species? North Sea sprat is data rich. In other words, we know a lot about it scientifically. And here it's interesting that sea warming and the altoplankton community that I described earlier could actually be beneficial to sprat work. This is described in the paper by Lizzie Green. And according to ICES, the stock's in a good state. The spawning stock biomass is the highest since the late 1970s, as you can see at the right-hand end of that graph. And the range of sprat is actually expanding in the North Sea. By contrast, in the Irish Sea, we have rather little knowledge of the sprat stock. It's data poor. I've shown the Irish Sea there on the map with Rockabill flagged in red. And currently, there's no management of the fishery according to Birdwatch Ireland. Fintan Kelly have been helpful to me here. There's no catch limits, no stock assessment or reference points, and no monitoring or enforcement. So this is a very concerning sort of hiatus in management of these important forage fish. And here's a slide similar to one that was shown yesterday, just showing that the area around Rockabill is indeed very important for the commercial fishery. It's a prey hotspot with a high fishery catch rate of sprat and juvenile herring. Flagged the Mourne herring spawning ground there, and Fintan also tells me there may well be a nursery area for Celtic Sea herring just off Rockabill. So this is really important. Sort of confluence of fishing and the Rockabill seabirds, the Rockabill roseates. So what about the developments in Irish waters, the policy developments? So in 2018, Birdwatch Ireland called for an evidence-based and an ecosystem-based approach to fishing for sprat and herring, reflecting the importance to roseates and other seabirds. And I show the front page of the report on the right there. Then this year, the government announced a ban on fishing vessels over 18 meters long, big vessels, fishing for sprat within 6 nautical miles of the coast. It'd be nice to think that Birdwatch Ireland influenced that decision. The government's given the industry 2 years till 2022 to implement this change to allow them to adjust their methodologies, their fishing methods. And of course, there's pushback from the industry on this. And then just recently, in June, the Irish Plan for Government committed to ban pair trawling, a very invasive method for herring, as you can see from the inset photograph there, 2 vessels pooling 1 net inside 6 nautical miles. So there are changes afoot, and we hope for the better. So in summary, sea warming and plankton changes appear to be negative for sand eel, and I haven't gone into it in detail, but they appear also to be negative for herring. Both of these species feed on the cold water Calanus finmarchicus, which is disappearing, and positive for sprat. Unlike kittiwake forage fisheries, have not yet been proven to reduce the productivity of roseate terns. But there is an increasing policy focus on an ecosystem-based and a precautionary approach to managing forage fisheries in order to mitigate the multiple risks we're witnessing to seabirds populations offshore, roseates included. And I would just like to say here that this closer attention now to forage fisheries in Britain and Ireland is also echoed on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's a transatlantic focus now. And here's a page from an Audubon blog about the introduction of the new Forage Fisheries Fish Conservation Act, which is on the table in Congress as we speak. The Act seeks to safeguard food for struggling seabirds in several of the ways that I've described for the situation here in the UK. So across the Atlantic, there's concern for forage fish. It's coming to the top of the agenda, and we hope to see changes that will benefit seabirds in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ewan, and thank you for struggling on through those technical difficulties to give us a really fascinating insight. If only we had longer to talk about that. That's a really interesting subject. I haven't got, oh, I'm just getting new questions appearing now. I'll save mine till the end then if we have time. We do have 5 minutes or so, I think, for questions. So Alexandra Fink is saying that overfishing seabird prey is an all-European challenge. How will Brexit impact the international effort to help protect fish spawning grounds?
Well, that's a very good and a very meaty question. As we speak, there are trade negotiations going on between the UK and its EU neighbours over access to UK fishing grounds. This is unresolved at the moment. It's a sticking point in the negotiations. And whereas the UK as an independent coastal state might theoretically be able to take back control of places like the UK part of the Dogger Bank or any of those UK waters on the North Sea coast, and indeed any other part of the UK coast, then it's going to be, it's an open question as to whether this will actually be achieved in the sort of the horse trading that goes on over quid pro quos. So, I mean, obviously the main discussion is with the Danish fleet, who will be desperate to maintain their access to the sand eel grounds, especially on the UK part of the Dogger Bank, which are highly productive and profitable for them. So at the moment, Brexit is not done and dusted by any means, and we don't know how it's going to play out yet.
Thank you, Ewan. Another question's come in, this time from Norman Ratcliffe, who says that looking in the winter range, overfishing caused the collapse of the Ghana round sardine stock in 1973, which then recovered after the mid-80s, and suggests that this mirrors the roseate population trend. And he's wondering if this is an overlooked smoking gun that has been largely overlooked in favour of trapping and loss of Tern Island to erosion in terms of population trends in roseate terns. You have a view?
Yes, thank you, Norman. It is indeed a smoking gun. And if I understand your question correctly, then the recent report from the Ghanaian waters, which I can share with you after this meeting, shows that the Ghanaian sardine stock is now in a more critical state than probably it's ever been, to the extent that they are fearing the extinction of the fishery, which of course is particularly heavy on the artisanal people who have a smaller exploitation rate than the big commercial guys offshore. So I'm very, very concerned about the status of sardine fisheries in the winter quarters. And I might just add that I'm also very concerned about the overfishing of tuna, which of course are critical to driving the prey fish to the surface, so that if the birds have neither the prey fish nor the predators to drive them to the surface, this could become an increasingly important factor as time goes on.
Yeah, complex interactions indeed. A question from David Tierney. Is there much known between forage fish abundance and its availability to seabirds, particularly with regard to oceanographic features such as the Western Irish Sea gyre?
I think it's it's obviously less important for sand eels, which are highly sort of attached to sandbanks. Once they, as I said at the beginning, once they settle on a sandbank, they're more or less sedentary there, and they're highly aggregated. And I think that becomes the critical thing. They don't probably move more than about 30 kilometers from their home base, if you like. Different sandbanks have different characteristics. Of course, the ones off the Isle of May, for example, have some quite singular attributes that you don't find, for example, on the Dogger Bank. So I think that for sand eels, that is more of a driver than the oceanographic factors. It may be less so for the more pelagic forage fish like the herring and the sprat, but probably can't go into much detail on that right now.
Thank you, Ewan. If only we had more time. It is something that we could talk for a long time about, I'm sure. And I'll have to ask you my questions later. It's time, I think, to move on to our next speaker for this session. So I would like to welcome Martin Perrow from the Econ Consultancy. Martin founded Econ in 1990 with the aim of bringing together consultancy and academic research to provide expert solutions to ecological issues. Martin and his team have been working for terns on 18 years. We heard a talk yesterday from Richard Berridge talking about the boat-based tracking of terns around Rockabill, and that's something that Econ have really pioneered around the UK. Martin joined the research team on Rockabill for the RSPB in 2018, and so apparently in doing so achieved an ambition to unravel the mysteries of at-sea foraging of all 5 of the UK and Ireland's breeding tern species. We're going to hear his recorded talk about interactions between terns and offshore wind farms and the implications for roseate terns, and he'll be joining us afterwards for questions. So please do put anything in the Q&A box as we go along if you have any questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Martin. Today I'm going to talk to you about the interactions between terns and offshore wind farms and the implications of wind farm development for roseate terns. The first picture here shows about 3,500 terns present on Scroby Sands in Norfolk, near the Scroby Sands wind farm. I'm going to tell you quite a lot about that site later in this talk. So the talk is based on personal experiences over the last 18 years and from 12 UK wind farm sites and zones. There's also quite a lot of background information drawn from Wildlife and Wind Farms Offshore Volumes 3 and 4, which was published in 2019. And you'll see references to those volumes dotted around through this talk. And the input there was from 68 authors from 13 countries. So really telling you all you want to know, about wind farms and their effects. I don't want to depress you right at the start of this talk, but I think we've been in this climate emergency for a while. And we're probably now in the F category in the timeline at the top of the screen there. And that's based on personal experiences of going to various places, such as Antarctica, where Seymour Island, when I was there, should have had an ice thickness all across it at about the same thickness of that block that's now just left, on the beach. So I think we're really into damage limitation with renewables-based decarbonisation. So in real terms, we need wind farms fast, but we should have them in an ecologically considered way as a win-win for both wind and for wildlife. So there have been 3 rounds of development in UK waters, plus the Scottish territorial water sites. And here they are shown on this diagram here. And we're now looking at extensions and into round 4. But if you look off the coast of Ireland, there's very little development in those initial rounds. But now there's quite a lot of sites proposed in Irish waters, and these are right near Rockabill, within foraging range and roseate and common terns. Here you can see the choices from Braymore Point, the nicer site, which is right outside Rockabill, Cooley Point, Cloggerhead and Oriel. it's useful to think about what the effects and impacts actually might be. Now, EIA and HRA tends to focus on birds as being like Santa in this slide. So often collision is seen as the key risk, and the impacts in this case might be that Santa is seriously compromised and Christmas is cancelled. Alternatively, displacement and barrier effects, which are also seen to be important, might be that the reindeer slalom every year, but that might be just a small proportion of the energy expenditure on their global travels. So there might be little impact of that. But what about the indirect ecosystem effects and impacts via habitats and prey, for birds? So in terms of collision risk offshore, the empirical evidence base is still very small. Just 9 or 10 collisions have ever been recorded, and 6 of those were from one study, the high-profile ORGIP study at Thanet. That's quite a long way from potential expectations. If you look onshore, then you might expect around 4.5 birds to collide with each turbine each year. So that would suggest around 20,000 birds per year colliding with the 4,500 or so offshore turbines in European waters. So we do have issues of detection. It's quite difficult to detect collisions at sea, and there's a general paucity of studies that can explain this very low number of collisions seen. And of direct relevance to this talk here, then no terns have yet been recorded colliding with wind farms. And part of that is linked to the principle that risk decreases with an increasing rotor gap. And what we've seen over time is that turbines increase in dimension. So they're getting further away from the water surface, so the bottom sweep of the turbine blade is then not a problem for relatively low flying birds. And that could include things like in this graphic TE, which is sandwich tern. So most of those might be expected to fly below that. Gulls, on the other hand, things like GB and HG, great black gull and herring gull, fly at greater height and might be exposed to greater risk. So when we get to something like Roseate Tern, this is data from Rockabill, and you can see that the bulk of the time that birds are out at sea, they're flying under 30 meters, which might mean that in the current climate of large turbines, they're really not at risk from colliding with those turbine blades. Having set up the possibility that terns by flying at relatively low height are at lower risk of collision than higher flying seabirds such as gulls, for example, we do need to bear in mind that collision rates are specific to site and turbine location and the behaviour of birds at that location. So somewhere like Zeebrugge, where the birds were breeding on one side of a line of turbines on a breakwater, and had to fly through them, to get to the open sea, was a particularly risky situation. Also bearing in mind that the passage rate of birds back and forth, was very high. So the losses at that site, affected the regional population with more than 1%, of that population lost per annum. And that was up to 156 common terns a year, up to 54 sandwich terns a year, and up to 12 little terns per year. Also, there was an interesting bias towards males in terms of collisions during the egg laying and incubation period when they were feeding females. So males were under pressure to rush back through those turbines, to feed a female. And no matter how fast you think terns might be, then turbine blades, are always faster. The other thing to bear in mind is that terns may not always be so aware of what's going on in front of them because of this tendency to focus, by looking down, as has been shown for the case for lots of raptors. So what we really need to understand is that the sort of horror show that we've seen at Zeebrugge, could that be replicated, to some site at sea? So perhaps the key study in terms of understanding the behaviour of terns at an offshore wind farm is the visual tracking study of sandwich terns at Sheringham Shoal. And the key part of this is that we had before, during and after tracks from the site. So what birds did before compared to what birds did after the site was installed. We also had a large number of individuals tracked, around 1,600, and the key take-home message that none were seen to collide or even near miss. However, we did have some surprises in relation to the behavior of the birds. Here you can see all the tracks from pre-construction and construction, in the top part of that graphic, and during operation in the bottom part of the graphic. And in fact, 32 to 44% fewer birds entered the operational site in the 3 years in which we tracked birds when the site was operating. So that was a bit of a surprise, for us. And the other key thing to point out, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will be able to see this, is that once birds were in the wind farm, those birds that did enter, they tended to fly between the turbine rows, often at greater height. So the birds often orientated themselves to sit right in the middle of those rows and just traverse the site in a straight line, straight through to the other side. So we need to ask the question about what does displacement actually mean, for birds and their populations ultimately. So in order to answer that question, we need to construct a conceptual framework that can be divided between barriers to movement and full displacement, the sort of thing that we demonstrated for sandwich terns at Sheringham Shoal there. And the key thing is you work through this graphic, from the top there, once the bird has demonstrated some sort of avoidance, down to the bottom of the graphic, is that the green elements, can be measured in one way or another. So we can look at how many birds are displaced, or how many birds have to move around a particular site. Unfortunately then, we have to rely on modelling a number of the red elements. So in other words, what does habitat loss actually mean for the bird? And the way we generally do that is looking at reduced energy intake or increased energy expenditure when the birds are displaced to another site where they didn't really want to be foraging, for example. And so really we're now looking at, to become an impact, that effect has to impinge on individual fitness. So that ultimately might be a loss of weight that then leads to a reduction in annual breeding output, for example, or reduced survival. And once you pull those effects together, then you can see through the effects on individuals, we have the possibility of changes in the overall population size at colonies. Not that we have any evidence of that at all at the moment. And in fact, because seabirds are so long-lived, it might take us a decade or more to actually construct that evidence. So going back to sandwich terns at Sheringham Shoal, what we saw pretty much immediately was, as you can see from this graphic, was a clear reduction in foraging rate inside the wind farm compared to outside. There was no difference during pre-construction or the initial phases of construction, but as soon as construction was really in its final stages, and then certainly through operation, we had this significant difference between the foraging rates inside and outside. And you then start to think about, well, what's the mechanism for that? What's going on? Now, it could be that sandwich terns that not necessarily show any fear of the site, they do pass through it, but they could be concentrating on traversing it and simply have no focus on feeding. So that could be one potential reason for the observation. We don't see any response of terns to increased vessel activity, so we're pretty confident that that's not the cause of this reduction in foraging rate. But really, it could really indicate a change in foraging conditions. And maybe there's something going on within the site that means that birds don't have the availability of prey that they might have had before. So that really starts to point to possible indirect effects of the construction and the operation of the site on potentially prey available to sandwich terns in this case. So like other terns, roseates, particularly at Rockerbill, rely on just a few prey species. So if we look at the pictures there, the top one is a sand eel that everybody might be familiar with. The one underneath that is a gadoid, probably a whiting. And the one to the right there with the headshot is a clupeid and probably an Atlantic herring. And when we look at the percentage of provisioned items at Rockerbill that birds bring back to chicks, you can see that you've got roughly maybe 50 to 70% clupeids by number. But in terms of biomass, because clupeids are very relatively short and thick compared to sand eels and have a high lipid content, then the biomass, is much higher amongst clupeids, so they become, critically important. Now, the interesting thing about clupeids is that clupeids are hearing specialists. They have an auditory apparatus that's linked to their swim bladder, and in theory, they're as good as hearing as whales, for example. They could hear construction in theory, to about 80 kilometers away. That doesn't mean to say they're going to respond at that point, but certainly when they're much closer, then there's certainly the risk of injury or even death. Sand eels, on the other hand, are thought to be far less sensitive without, this swim bladder, and this auditory apparatus. So here we are back at Scroby Sands with some work that we published back in 2011. We'd monitored fish before the wind farm was constructed in 2002 and 2003. You can see the green bars there, with abundance of clupeids before construction. Then construction came in, and immediately afterwards there was a significant decline, in the catches of fish. Then when we went back in 2013, many years later, the fish population was still, pretty low. So that construction unintentionally coincided with a spawning period of herring, at that site, which we then subsequently linked to recruitment failure of those fish, which don't appear to have particularly recovered even after some period of time. Now, it's one thing having an effect on fish, but you really need to demonstrate the effect on the birds. And we could also do that in terms of the foraging success of little terns at the site. So little terns were exploiting clupeids as their primary prey source at was then their largest UK colony. So foraging rates declined, and then we started to see birds abandon, leave eggs, etc., etc. So led on to reduced reproductive success as well. So the interesting thing about these potential indirect effects, that personally I think are rather common, are really very rarely evaluated in EIA, simply because they're often seen as being too difficult. We speculated that the problem for fish at Scroby Sands was ultimately piling noise, which is an incredibly noisy activity, up to 260 decibels, at source. And it's interesting that in Germany, legislation restricts the peak of piling noise to be less than 190 decibels at 750 meters away. Curiously, that's not really taken forward in the UK, so there's not particular mitigation for piling noise. There are several options, of course, to mitigate noise at the source, in the channel between the source of the noise and the receiver, and that could be fish in this case, and at the receiver itself. And marine mammals particularly are often subject to noisy devices to scare them away from the more significant noise of pile driving. So we can have casings and bubble curtains that can operate at source to dampen at high frequency, and that's shown here in this picture. These are sort of things that are really good for mammals, but not for fish, because fish tend to hear at lower frequencies. So in that case, then the way forward is to look at low noise gravity bases and suction buckets as the base, for the turbines to be installed. So rather than banging away, with monopiles, back into that sediment. The other possibility is to have some sort of temporal avoidance and have maybe a spawner restriction, at the time of construction. So we would have had a spawner restriction at Scroby. I doubt that we would have seen the effect on our herring that we did. Turbines are generally accompanied by scour protection in the form of rocks laid up to around 50 meters around each turbine base. And the turbine bases and that scour protection quickly get colonized by hard substrate fauna like mussels or anemones that then offer reef habitat, for things like, crabs, lobsters, and small fishes. Interestingly enough, the substrate fauna between turbines also benefits from a restriction on trawling activity, which is seen to be dangerous in wind farms as a result of catching cables. So this reef habitat quickly becomes a hotspot, for large predatory fish, and in the North Sea that would include, Atlantic cod. And here's some nice work from Belgium on the, and that's that picture on the right-hand side there. that shows the clusters of tagged fish, around, turbine bases, and those fish generally don't, move much apart from going off to spawn. Now, the presence of those large predatory fish offers a lot of risk, for small forage pelagic fish like clupeids and sand eels. And it could be that the presence of those big fish means that those small fish are pushed out of wind farms, and consequently, there's no good foraging habitat for things like terns, within wind farms. I was blown away, if you pardon that pun, by the work that had been undertaken on the wind wake effect in recent times. We'd been familiar with the sort of images produced by Vattenfall, of these sort of vortices behind, turbines, but I don't think we were really aware of, what that meant in terms of, subsurface, interactions. And what goes on is that, the wind wake effect, can then affect changes in Ekman transport below the surface that can ultimately lead to, convergence and divergence of water masses. So where you've got divergence, then that can lead to upwelling, and convergence can then lead to downwelling. And we're probably familiar with the idea of upwelling being quite important for bringing nutrients to the surface in particular places. But what's happening here is that effect is operating on a much larger scale than just the individual wind farm. So that can be something operating over 10 times, the wind farm area. And this doesn't have to be a bad thing, in the sense that we might get nutrient, upwelling away from the wind farm that could feed, bring things to the surface and then feed birds, at some distance away from the wind farm. And we just need to understand, really, what's going on. There's ecosystem effects, at work here. So as well as the wind wake effect, I think we also need to talk about the possibility of sediment transport, from scour, operating around turbines where that's not fully protected, and particularly in dynamic situations. And there's nowhere more dynamic than Scroby Sands. So this was an emergent bank that was out the whole time between the 1940s and 1960s, and occasionally up to 1976. And it eventually, after 76, became submerged at high water. When it was emergent, it supported, quite large, tern colonies at about 3 kilometers, offshore. Now, curiously, within a few months of wind farm construction, from being submerged for nearly 40 years at, at high water, suddenly the bank emerged, the whole time on a permanent basis. It did overtop occasionally at, on the highest tides and in storms, but generally, it was out. And what we then saw is a subsidiary sandbar that set up from the wind farm in that middle picture there, down towards, the main bank. And over time, that subsidiary sandbar eventually coalesced, with the main bank to form a much larger feature. The main bank then started to migrate north, towards the wind farm, and then really increased in height. And you can see that from the sort of dry nature of it in that bottom right-hand corner. So 6 years after the wind farm at Scroby was constructed, the bank was recolonised by common terns, up to 200 pairs, and that was probably the entire population of the Breydon SPA, which, as far as I know now, doesn't have any common terns in it. We also saw the colonisation of little terns, up to 70 pairs in those initial years, and then after about 3 years, sandwich terns colonised with up to 250 pairs within 5 years. And then remarkably, back in 2013, we had a pair of roseates in the common tern colony. I can't exactly confirm that they bred or not, but this shows up the possibility of terns recolonising rather quickly. So the situation at Scroby might be quite exceptional. We might not expect to see banks re-emerging at various other sites that would be good for terns, but it just shows you the scope of the sort of effects, the ecosystem effects that can happen as a result of wind farms being installed. So hopefully I've shown you that offshore wind farms may have negative, neutral, or even positive effects and impacts, but relatively few of those are fully understood, particularly on terns. But what we must do is consider all possible impacts, in EIA or HRA, especially the indirect ecosystem effects on prey. So when we get to somewhere like Rockabill, we might not be that worried about roseate terns colliding, although it's still possible. Birds may be displaced, but for me particularly, I'm pretty interested in the possibility of this Morn herring spawning ground, the area in pink there, really underpinning the success of the roseate tern colony. We also might have quite an influence of the Manx spawning ground, for herring around the Isle of Man, and you could easily get movement of herring across the Irish Sea and then feeding birds, both roseates and commons, at Rockabill. So it's the influence of construction of wind farms and their subsequent operation, on those fish prey that could be key, to all this. So overall, what I'm suggesting is that where things are uncertain, then the precautionary principle, must be, adopted, and maybe just avoiding, important areas. And particularly if there's some sites that show up to be the worst sites, where predicted cumulative impacts are just too high, then potentially, they should be avoided, as well. And all this has precedent for terns in the Greater Wash. The Greater Wash was a round 2 strategic area for wind farm development, and a large number of sites were proposed in the area, all within reach of sandwich terns from the North Norfolk Coast SPA, comprising Scalt Head Colony on the left there and Blakeney Point Colony on the right. And these are individual tracts of birds from those colonies, and you can see that birds had the potential to mix at somewhere like Docking Shoal. And this was confirmed by boat-based surveys that showed the Docking Shoal area had the highest densities of birds in general. And in terms of being modelled for collision risk, then Docking came forward as the site that had potentially the highest level of collisions. So when all sites were put forward, the cumulative risk from collision was seen to be too high to have a potential on the entire population. And Docking was the site that was ultimately rejected by the Secretary of State at the time. So ultimately it was rejected on this basis of the cumulative probability of risk of population decline, from that, collision. There was also some other mitigation action in the area, and that was to do with the avoidance of sandwich tern hotspots, at Race Bank. It was quite easy to demonstrate that birds tended to concentrate, on the edges of Race Bank where there were good foraging conditions, and they were ultimately excluded from development as tern-sensitive areas. So that was my Roseate Tern shout out. So thanks to all our sponsors over the years, all the people we've worked with, shown on the slide there, and especially thanks to Daniel for the invitation and for your kind attention. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin. Another fascinating talk. I have a question that has just disappeared. Let me just retrieve that. I had a question that actually came in from Ewan Dunn, who is on the panelist link and therefore can't post it in the questions box. But he asked whether floating turbines.
Come on.
He asks whether floating turbines could mitigate the impact on clupeids spawning.
Yes. I don't really need to say more than that, I don't think. Without the key problem for spawning activity particularly is about pile driving. So yes, we could go to alternative bases, which are generally seen to be more expensive. Pile driving is a thing that's operated so far on about 80% of all turbines everywhere. So if you avoided that, that's a great start. And then of course you can go to floating wind, as being another possibility. It's still tethered to the ground generally, so you still have cables, so it's not completely drifting around. It's tethered in one way or another, so that has to be put in. Still has some installation, but that's relatively straightforward and easy, and can be done in a short time frame. So floating turbines are a good solution.
Is that something that the industry is seriously looking at, as far as you're aware?
Well, it hasn't done so far. Obviously, we've got High Wind, which operates as the world's first floating, wind farm, and there are more proposals for floating wind farms. And I think once we move off into deeper water in round 4 and elsewhere in the world, then floating will be a real part of the mix. I think people were waiting to see, what High Wind did and whether it would be successful or not.
Okay. And actually, yes, Matty Murphy says they're looking at floating wind at the moment in the questions box. I have a question from Joan Walsh, who asks, what is the spacing and type of turbine used at Sheringham Shoal? She says, in the US, we are looking at 1 nautical mile spacing and 10 to 14 megawatt turbines, which seems significantly larger and with a wider spacing than most UK or European arrays.
Yeah, I think the US has come late to the party, so it has the benefit of taking on the very big turbines that are now proposed. So Sheringham has 3.6s, and they're about 600 meters apart in one dimension. Obviously, as you get bigger and bigger turbines, turbines are incredibly efficient, so they steal wind from each other. So you typically see rows of turbines where the front one is turning and the back one isn't, because they've stolen wind from each other. So people have really understood that over time. So the spacing has started to increase. So 1 nautical mile is potentially good. The issue with that is that site then becomes porous. So on one level, as a block of turbines, birds will go around it and not go through it and not expose themselves to risk. If you have big areas between them, birds might be drawn into that. So sometimes you might increase the potential risk for some species. So there's a balancing act in there somewhere, and we really don't know about how birds interact. We've certainly proposed travel corridors for birds between blocks of turbines as being a good solution to cut down on displacement effects. But how that really works out in the whole mix is another question. So yes, those turbines are very big, and yes, they have a big spacing, but you sort of need to watch that as well.
Yeah, okay. I suppose as well as we're thinking mainly about terns here, but of course we're often on migration routes along these coastlines, so we need to be thinking about all kinds of bird movements.
Absolutely.
We have a comment from Sylvia. There is a new study by May et al. 2020 regarding wind turbine colour. The study revealed that mortality rate was decreased by 70% when turbines were painted black. As I recall, actually, the image showed one of the 3, I don't know the technical word, but one of the 3 arms of the turbine.
Yeah, one of the 3 blades. Yeah, we actually, that's from the Norwegian Institute, from Nina, and we published in the same book, the volume 4, Roll May, gave us a little sort of box in one of our chapters that indicated that they were trying it and it could work for seabirds. And it's something, that whole idea of blades have motion smear because they turn very quickly. So you end up as not being able to really pick them out, as a moving object. If you paint one turbine black, it's a bit like having a spinning wheel as a kid. You then see a band of color, spinning round. And that was done, well, it was done back in the 1950s originally, as somebody that came up with that, idea. And it's nice to see that idea pop up again. It's certainly used onshore already in Germany. You often see, one blade painted red in Germany, for example. So that sort of thing could also, be quite effective, I think.
Yeah, as I recall, I've forgotten what I recall now. Sorry, juggling multiple information streams. It's not passing too far. We're a little bit pushed for time, so given that I haven't got another new question coming in at the moment. Oh, I do. Okay, I'll squeeze in one last question, seeing as it's popped in just in time. This is actually from Daniel. And he asks what the key advocacy messages we should work on with the statutory agencies should be for the environmental impact assessments associated with wind farms.
Do them properly. I think people over time, when we first started this, we used to include indirect effects, in EIAs, and I think a lot of that has sort of dropped away, over time. We have quite almost a national obsession with collision risk and collision risk modelling. And I think we really need to put that partly, you still need to do it, but put it aside to some extent and really think about the ecosystem effects. Because I think that 4,500 turbines in the North Sea and in European waters, you know, they're changing the nature of the North Sea. There's lots of studies that indicate that, even if it's about, you know, mussel filtration on turbine bases, they can take out a significant proportion of production, you know, for example, which I didn't touch upon here. So it's the ecosystem effects that really need to be considered. And you might not get to answers with those, but at least you can come up with some sort of risk framework, you know, how to do that. So I'm really suggesting thinking out of the box, you know, rather than the same old lines that have been adopted for a while.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think it's fantastic that we see your work published, and so we can, you know, it's there and available for people to be thinking about these questions and addressing these really complex issues and not putting things in the too difficult box where we can help it.
Yeah, it's all in the books. So go onto the Pelagic website now.
So we now have a 30-minute coffee break. We are due back at 3 o'clock for the final session of the day, which will be about delivery of long-term recovery. So I hope everyone will be able to join us for that.